Hey, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Open Forum podcast. Today, we have with us Brook Jackson. Brook Jackson is the former regional director over at Ventavia for a few of the clinical trial sites that were involved in the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine trials. And she has almost around 2 decades of experience in clinical research auditing. And Brooke, that's enough from me. Why don't you take 2 minutes, introduce us to who you are, and then we'll talk about what it is that brings us here today.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to introduce myself and tell the story that I feel belongs to everybody. I have been doing clinical research from the coordinating aspects of trials all the way to managing those. I've been a director of operations for a small site management organization. I did that for several years, and really when I left that last position, I was looking for something more that would keep me home a little more often and less travel. And so I started looking for another position and found one in my area, in the Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas area, and applied and was pretty much immediately offered the position. And that's kind of where we'll start, I guess, with my time at Ventavia Research Group. So Ventavia Research Group is just what I mentioned a moment ago, a clinical research organization. That's how they define themselves, but I would characterize them more as a site management organization. So what they'll do is contract with either a clinical research organization, a CRO, or a contract organization, really. And those contract research organizations are the ones typically that will contract with big pharma companies. And Ventavia was hired to manage Pfizer's pivotal phase 3 trial back in the fall of 2020.
Yeah, and it's that obviously that brings us to this conversation here today. As some of you may know, some of you may not know, Brooke is the person that blew the whistle essentially on some issues that were occurring over at Ventavia during the clinical trial period while you were there. And these are things that were reported in the British Medical Journal and also substantiated by former colleagues of yours as well. And some of those things included data manipulation, unblinding of patients, adverse event follow-ups not being done, and some other issues with what would be considered not good laboratory practice. But yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit about what it was that you saw that made you think, I need to bring this up to someone, and then we'll talk about the process that happened after you bringing it up and up to the time, including the dismissal as well.
Sure. So my time at Ventavia was brief. I was only there in total 18 days. Yeah. Actually, the first day that I started was a US holiday. And so on the 7th, which was my start date of September of 2020, I wasn't on site. I was actually just doing some, HR type training, et cetera, reading over protocols. And so my first day on the job was a Tuesday, the 8th of September. And I knew immediately when I walked in that it was going to be a challenge that I was up for, with, like you mentioned, my years of experience. I was excited. I was ready to just dive into what I needed to. So I did that with an open mind, knowing that in my job description, that little job description down at the very end where they tell you other job duties, as described or as assigned rather,
Yeah, there'll
So,
be other little things that they sprinkle over the top of your work. Yeah,
right,
yeah.
and that was fine. And so my first day, I just wanted to get an idea. I was at one of the three locations that was participating in this particular study in the Pfizer vaccine trial. And I wanted to just get, and sorry, that was my dog. That was my
No
dog.
worries.
I
I've got one and two
apologize.
cats, so I'm used to
Okay.
it.
Okay. So the first day, I really just wanted to get an idea for the feel of the clinic. And I was introduced to some of the staff members, the coordinators that, see the patients, record their visit data, et cetera. So really just to get acquainted with the staff and the clinic flow. And so I chose just one of the research coordinators to shadow that day. And the first thing that I watched her do was an informed consent of a new patient that was interested in participating in the study. So we walk into an exam room and I sit down and, obviously we had the patient's permission that I be there, but I watched her initiate this informed consent process. And I really like to point out the fact that informed consent is not just a moment where a patient signs and dates their consent form. It is a process. It takes time. This was not a complicated study, but it required a level of understanding, especially for a patient that has never participated in research before. This was a novel vaccine. We were in the middle of a pandemic. So it just, and I can't remember exactly how many pages the informed consent was, but it was pretty lengthy. I want to say, 30 plus pages of information.
Jeez.
That has to, yeah, it was long. That has to be explained to the patient and, them given an opportunity to ask questions, maybe for the study doctor that was over to the trial to come in and explain some of those more technical questions or right that the study coordinator wouldn't be qualified to answer. But when the patient was brought in and she started the informed consent, it wasn't a complete informed consent to me. It was basically like here's the informed consent, here's where you sign, here's where I want you to date, let's go. They would frequently, every day that I was there, be scheduling too many patients for the number of staff that we had. So they were really just rushing to get patients in and out. So as I watched her, giving the informed consent to the patient, it wasn't thorough. So I actually stepped in, having, read the protocol prior to the stay. I'd read the informed consent. So I just stepped in and gave a proper informed consent. The patient went on to enroll into the study. And so that was really, sorry, that was a really long answer, but that was the first thing that that I saw when I went in. One, how busy the clinic was. Two, how understaffed we were. And I guess three, the lack of informed consent. So I talked with the research coordinator about that. Informed consent to me is just, it's so important. It's the first thing that we do when a patient enters into a study, and it's a process that continues at every turn. Yeah. We want to make sure that patient is still informed, that they still want to participate in the study. And that goes, again, from before they enroll to the completion of the study.
Okay. So that was the first moment that sort of pricked your ears up to, hey, there's maybe a couple of the things that in your role as part of your duty was something that you would then highlight to be cleaned up. Essentially, guys, there's some issues here that I think we need to address. you'd pass that on, and you guys would create some form of quality control to ensure that that's done adequately, shall we say?
Of course.
Right.
Of course.
And then I think to anyone listening, can you maybe highlight a couple things from this particular trial in terms of informed consent that you think should or could have been mentioned to the participant or participants that maybe weren't emphasized or maybe weren't put across to someone who was participating?
Sure. Gosh, there's so many.
Maybe
Safety.
pick 2 or 3. Yeah.
Safety, is the one thing that jumps out at me. Risks of participating. The patient's not obligation, but what they're required to do, the study visits that they are to come in for. They're one of the big things was in the study, they were either given a provision device or we downloaded an app on their phone, and that was to track any adverse events that they experienced during their participation. And that was, again, there were several patients that I read on that didn't even get trained on how to use that device. So those are a few things that stuck out to me. Again, safety, risk of participating in the study, required visits.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Self-reporting of adverse events, I think, is also something that's probably an important thing to have in a study of this magnitude, as something that, if everything goes well, would have and has been pumped out to everybody, quite simply. Okay, so then we press a little further forward. This is after your first day or so in clinic. What other things were there that stuck out to you? Because after you did essentially blow the whistle, because you made some reports to your colleagues and felt that they weren't being maybe taken as seriously or maybe acted upon, you then decided to take it to the next level and send some information off to the FDA. And shortly after that is the termination point. So maybe if you can highlight the things that further pricked your ears up a little bit, and then were the things that you decided after reporting to your colleagues, you then decided, actually, we have to take this a step further if it's not being acted on. Yeah.
So I kind of mentioned this a moment ago, the lack of staff. So we had, I'm trying to remember exactly, 5 exam rooms, I believe, and about that many clinical research coordinators. And the clinical research coordinators are really essential in the screening and the enrollment and the management of the study participants from beginning to end. The principal investigator, the study doctor that's over the trial is really there to manage manage the patient, but to review initially the eligibility criteria, to do those things that are out of our scope, like a physical exam, for example, or an assessment of a laboratory value or an adverse event. So they manage those more those types of assessments. And so the number of patients that Ventavia was enrolling was it was too many for the staff that we had. Excuse me. So the number of patients, lack of staff, lack of space was something else that was a concern of mine. A part of Pfizer's protocol after a patient's injected with either the placebo or the vaccine, which we only the person giving the vaccine at this point should have known what the patient was actually receiving. So they prepare it, they inject it, and they manage that one aspect, and that is it. So it drives me crazy to even to go back and even think about this. But because of the space, especially after a patient was vaccinated, the vaccinator would take the patient out of their exam room and put them wherever there was space for them to be. Our waiting rooms were typically full, and the exam rooms were full, and they would be put in the hallway with absolutely zero medical
Oversight.
supervision.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no medical oversight, no privacy. They were literally sitting in folding chairs in the hallway or in the reception area or in our laboratory area within the clinic. I mean, we're just putting them anywhere we had a spot. So to open up that exam room so the next patient that wanted to enroll could,
Come on
be
through
seen.
and take a seat and roll up the sleeve.
Exactly.
This seems more a massive protocol issue if there's no supervision. But it does, in a way, feel like something that could have quite adequately been resolved on site without further, without need to go to the FDA, for example. Do you know what I mean? It seems like something that, relatively speaking, they should have been able to do there, right?
Yes. Yes. I tried many times talking to the members of our leadership team. It was myself. There was another regional director. We had a director of quality control. We had a director of operations. We had two managing members and a CEO. So every morning at 8:00, we would have a meeting to discuss action items. I mean, it varied day to day. But on this call, we discussed these issues every single day. And they were very, I don't know how to describe it. Just, I guess I would say supportive. They would bring in other coordinators from other locations that weren't as busy to help in certain circumstances. They would really push praise, thank you guys so much. Be sure to thank your coordinators, get them breakfast, get them lunch, get them dinner, make sure that they're staying on track and offering bonuses even for the extra time that they put in on top of any overtime that they would receive. But yeah, we talked about these issues every day.
Yeah.
And they acknowledged them, and they were truly, I am okay saying this because there were some things that Ventavia did well. They tried initially to bring in more people. They went on a hiring frenzy, I guess. So they were trying to bring in more people because they understood that they were just severely understaffed. So, that they did well. They advertised for their study well, but they did way more things wrong than they did right. And they knew that. And they knew that I was very vocal about what I was seeing, what I brought to their attention. And in the beginning, when I would bring up these things, for example, a lot of them administrative type things, our SOPs, our COVID preparedness plan, they were just supportive of, but they were things that I could only bring to their attention. I could only tell you that your SOP doesn't make sense and that we're not following it. Here's my suggestion based on regulatory guidelines and good clinical practice and all those things that we spend so many hours, training for.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But then if we go a little bit further, there were some other things that you'd mentioned, such as the adverse event the fact that there was an app for that where patients could do it.
Mhm.
But there's also the element of there were some adverse event follow-up issues as well. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, it goes speaks directly to the staffing. They were busy seeing patients, and Ventavia was paid on a per patient basis mainly. I never had an opportunity to look at their contract. We had somebody that was in charge of that. That person was actually the mother of our chief executive officer. So she handled all the finances. We never looked.
Interesting.
Yes, I never saw a budget one time, but in my experience, I've negotiated contracts, budgets many times. So in my experience, it's on a per patient basis mainly. Yep. So that was their goal, was to enroll as many patients as possible, as quickly as possible, with Pfizer right behind them, pushing every step of the way. And that's kind of, we can talk about that a little more, but yeah, the adverse event follow-up didn't happen frequently because there just were not enough people to manage those.
Can you maybe talk to us about some of those adverse events? Are you aware of any specifics that you're allowed to talk about?
I know of a few specific, but this was such so widespread. We were receiving calls from patients that were not able to get a hold of the site directly because they weren't able to check their voicemail or their emails. So these patients would become frustrated and they would reach out directly to Pfizer. And then there was a Pfizer employee that would email the site or call the site. And that's at that point when they would finally be managed, or when we would receive emails directly from ICON or from Pfizer begging for information or follow-up from adverse events, but even serious adverse events. There was one that just sticks out in my mind so clearly, and it was 11 days since the patient had reported a serious adverse event, and not one time had the site reached out to speak to the patient. Yes. And I don't think it's necessary to go into the details of what adverse events or what serious adverse events. The point is they were reported, and some of them not, but they were infrequently followed up on. And I just can't even imagine how many were reported by the patient, but not captured,
not followed up,
site,
yeah,
and not followed up.
I mean, I'm totally with you there. As there's the young girl who was part of the trial process, whose serious adverse event was noted as a normal adverse event, as stomach pain, despite the fact that she was then wheelchair bound and unable to at times feed or clothe herself. So
yeah, you're speaking of Maddie De Garay.
That's the one.
And,
yeah,
and she was in Pfizer's study,
in Pfizer's trial. Yeah,
and you're exactly right. I don't remember the actual diagnosis, but basically
stomach pain is what I remember.
Functional abdominal pain.
That was it.
Yeah.
So this is for anyone listening. I think this is why there's so much importance on the reporting of both adverse and serious adverse events. Like you say, we don't need to speak into specifics of the one that you've mentioned, but to give an idea of one that's in the public domain, that is one that has been noted and has been made public as a serious adverse event that was improperly reported, and there's no other two ways about it.
Right.
Another thing that you mentioned was there was some data manipulation going on as well. Are you able to speak to that? I think
sure.
We'll go over that first.
Yeah. So I would say around the 14th of September, when I really had more of an opportunity to start the internal auditing process, is when a lot of the things started kind of making sense to me. And I was going through each of these charts, and some of the things that I found were, again, back to the informed consent, just missing signatures, missing dates, which is just sloppy, right? I mean, that's what it is, sloppy. But as I was going through the chart further, I would notice that there would be missing blood pressure, missing temperatures, missing signatures on inclusion exclusion criteria, which, a patient, when they're enrolling into a study, per Pfizer's protocol, you had to meet specific criteria. You had to ensure that the patient qualified based on exactly. It met every inclusion criteria and met none of the exclusion criteria. And then you have to have a qualified medical professional sign off prior to enrolling the participant in the study. So at that point, once that would be done, then they would be randomized and we would go from there. But looking through these charts, and there were hundreds of them. So this, again, was done at three study sites. I was the director of two of those. One was in Keller, one was in Fort Worth, Texas, and the other was in Houston, Texas. So the second regional director was the one that was managing the Fort Worth location, but the same problems existed there when I would audit or monitor the second location of mine. I was finding the same thing. So informed consent errors, horrible study assessments that were not being done, samples that were mislabeled. There were so many things that were being done incorrectly. And as I was taking my findings, I was overwhelmed. And I've been doing this for a long time, and it does take a lot to overwhelm me, but I was just, the patients were coming in and follow-up visits needed to be done. And we only had 5 coordinators and we needed 15. So I'm taking these concerns directly to my direct manager, which was the director of operations. And she was overwhelmed. I mean, she was doing the same thing that I was doing at one site, but at another site, because we were just trying to catch up. And she told me very frequently, and I just got so tired of hearing it, but put it on a list. Put your concerns down on a list, and eventually we'll get to it. And so I started making this list, and on the 25th of September, she calls me into this meeting, and I get upset and I'm crying, and she's just, that's another story. But I told her I have 39 different concerns just on this list that you told me to create. And it wasn't just 39 things that I found. These were 39 areas of concern and problems that I'd been finding, not just on one patient, but on the majority of patients. And it was speed and it was haste. It was a lack of experience. They were hiring people that were not qualified to be in the positions that they were in. And it was just, when I think back about it, it makes me so mad. It pisses me off, to be honest, that Ventavia allowed this to go on for so long. But it wasn't just Ventavia. Okay. So Icon had a responsibility here too. And as did Pfizer. They knew that there was missing data. They knew that these things were going on, and they did nothing about it except push Ventavia to enroll more.
Yeah.
And
from one of the bits that I saw from one of the released exhibits from the trial that was recently essentially abandoned, where the US government had decided not to proceed, was that you'd brought this up on multiple occasions, was that, there is the element of multiple times your concerns were raised. And this idea of missing data is quite frankly worrying, considering that this has now been widely used. Aside from missing signatures or blood pressure, was there any pertinent clinical data, to your knowledge, that was missing?
Sure. I mean, one thing that happened, it happened on like just a few days after, so I would say around the 16th of September of 2020, when we're going through and auditing these charts and making our list, but never determining what the root cause was. I mean, I could tell you it was a lack of staff, lack of training, lack of experience. We never did anything about it. And on or around the 16th, it was discovered that the randomization scheme was being placed in every participant's chart, their file. And what that does is unblind the patient to anybody who looks at that information. So again, the only person that should have known what the patient got in terms of the vaccination or the placebo was the person that was preparing and injecting. And when you unblind somebody, I've had to be very careful about talking about the safety, the efficacy, what unblinding does, because I'm not a lab-coated scientist. That's been pointed out multiple times, but I am an expert at what I do. And I know what unblinding does. And what it does is inject a bias. And I always try to find an example of a way to help someone that doesn't understand clinical trials like I do, understand what that potential bias can do. And that is, for this particular trial, if the patient gets their injection a week later, 10 days later, contacts the clinical trial site and says, I'm sick. What do I do? Well, we talk to the physician, and the physician opens up the chart, and they're looking through the chart, and they see this patient got the vaccine. We know the vaccine, we've been told that the vaccine works really well. So it's unlikely that that patient has COVID. It's probably just something else viral. We don't need to test him or her. And so he or she doesn't. The doctor does not test because they know that patient got the vaccine and they think that it's working. But the patient actually does have COVID, let's just say. So that patient has been vaccinated, gets an infection, a COVID infection, but we never test, so we never know, so it's never reported. So that speaks to the overall, one, efficacy, but also the safety. What if that illness had nothing to do with, the symptoms of COVID, but rather the symptoms of the injection? So that's kind of just an example of what unblinding actually, or unmasking, some people refer to it as, what it does to, the integrity of the overall study. And the unblinding happened in every single one of the enrolled participants from the beginning of enrollment through the middle of September. When that was realized, I'm sorry, did you have a question?
No, go.
When that was realized, the very next morning, this was on the 17th, I'm for sure about that date. During our morning call, I made the recommendation that Ventavia immediately stop enrolling into the study. We were putting patient safety. Didn't matter. It mattered to me. So I said, we have got to stop enrolling patients into the study until we are able to get a full understanding of exactly what we are doing and what we've done. Per Pfizer's own protocol, when someone is unblinded in the study, they should have immediately stopped enrolling and contacted Pfizer. We didn't do that. We realized that we had unblinded every single participant potentially. I'm not saying everyone was unblinded, but people that had access to the randomization scheme had access to the patients, and therefore the data should not have been used in their overall analysis of the study. So instead of doing that, instead of contacting Pfizer, they decided to come up with a message that we would give to Pfizer why we were going to pause enrollment or stop enrollment. That message, they wanted to be consistent throughout all 3 study sites. Excuse me. And that message was to tell Pfizer that we were in the most perfect place, that we had met our bandwidth, that with the upcoming visit 2s and visit 3s, that we were in a perfect place to just kind of slow things down. And on top of that, they wanted to start bringing in friends and family members to go through these patient charts and take out that randomization scheme that was evidence that we had unblinded all of these clinic patients, all these patients.
So just to clarify, if a patient saw their file, they'd be able to know what way they were. Like you say, because it's a double-blinded trial, the only persons that should have known was the one delivering the injection. But if they had something, be they in the placebo or in the intervention group, when the doctor, the physician, was going to review their file, the physician would also then be unblinded, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, and that just to doubly clarify, in normal instances, that wouldn't be the case.
The gold standard in research is for studies to be randomized, double-blind, controlled.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, just to punctuate the point even further, the fact that the physician would then find out as they're reviewing the patient file, rather than just seeing they got injection A versus injection B, they would then know, hey, okay, this is the Comirnaty injection, so we know there might be some flu-like symptoms following it, but it can't be COVID because it's super effective from our phase 2. So this is where the issue of a lack of testing comes into it. If I remember, I'm going to say around 400 and something patients weren't tested from the clinical trial group, despite showing symptoms, right?
Yes.
And
I don't remember the exact number.
No.
I probably have it here somewhere, but it was in the hundreds.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that could quite significantly change the data, given that during or the Pfizer release after 6 months of the trial data showed around 15 people or something like that catching COVID.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if there's hundreds that for whatever reason were decided not to have been tested, that could quite significantly shift the goalposts.
Absolutely. Leaving the determination. It's the design of the study, which was flawed from the very beginning. Just that one principal investigator decision to test or not to test. Add in those reasons that they weren't tested, whatever those were. Now couple in unblinding of 1,000+ patients. And that has the potential to change that overall efficacy so much, and so much so that they may not have even met the required efficacy, which I believe it was 50%.
Yeah, something like that from what I remember. And I think something worth us noting here is that a lot of people, when they speak to this situation in an attempt to debunk, they say, yeah, but the Ventavia site was only 3 sites and it only had 1,000 people. So, how much would it have really affected things? But just looking at the numbers there, from X amount of people not being tested, despite showing some kind of symptom, do you think that that's a fair rebuttal at all?
Absolutely not, because they don't understand. And I don't mean to criticize anybody, because, looking at a trial that's enrolled 44,000 people, when you talk about such egregious conduct at just 3, because it's just 3 and it's just 1,000 out of 44, it doesn't,
doesn't
probably seem like it doesn't.
No.
But if you understand how they calculated their efficacy and how the trial was designed, it certainly matters. It matters so much. It was, I mean, look at how serious. I mean, it was a worldwide problem. It wasn't just, in the state of Texas. It was everywhere. We were looking at rolling out this vaccine to millions and millions of people.
At this
and
stage,
at least
4 point something billion. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. But it for me, understanding research like I do, it warranted an inspection, at least from the FDA, when I made my complaint. I'm an expert. I'm credible. I tried to bring it to the attention of the other members of the management team. I made an anonymous complaint to Pfizer in September, and I made a complaint to the FDA, and no one has ever done anything about it. And that also pisses me off.
Yeah, that's an interesting bit there, right? You made the complaint a few times, and you also brought it to the FDA, to Pfizer, and yet nothing to date. We're talking now on the 18th of Feb 2022, 2 years past the date. Nothing has been done. There's been no follow-up in that regard. Not
from the Food and Drug Administration. I left. I didn't leave. I got fired from Ventavia on the 25th of September of 2020, about 6 hours after I made the determination to
file a complaint.
File it. Yeah. So 6 hours later, I'm fired. And that was under the pretext that I was not a good fit. And I know that I wasn't a good fit because I wasn't going to do what they wanted me to do. And that was fraudulent. I wasn't going to participate. I wasn't going to be a part of that. And it makes me sad.
Yeah. Essentially, there was a lot of cleanup that they would have rather, if it was addressed, would have been a lot further down the line.
It's funny that you say cleanup, because I think that's really when Ventavia's attitude towards me changed. It was praise from day one through probably the 21st of September. I was invited to a call. The title of this call was COVID 001 cleanup call. And I declined the call because I know what was going to be discussed. And that was more ways to cover up all the things that we were finding. And there was so many. I think in my FDA complaint, I listed 14 different things that kind of in the moment stuck out to me. I was not hesitant to file the complaint at all, but I was scared. I really felt like at that point, once I filed the complaint, that I was going to lose my job. I was actually worried. for good reason, obviously, but warned also from one of the site managers that I was speaking to one day. She said, Brooke, if you go forward with speaking out against Ventavia, they are going to fire you. It's happened before. It's happened since I've left. They have some major problems going on there. But in the FDA complaint I made on the 25th, listed out just the concerns that were on the top of my mind. And I remembered the email so clearly. And it says, it is without hesitation that I am reporting concerns about patient safety. And I go in to talk about that first. And there are many things that I could have added to that list, but these, again, were just kind of what was on the top of my head. Filed that at about 9 o'clock in the morning. And again, a few hours later, I'm canned.
Just by happenstance, just magically 6 hours later, which, brings also some other issues at hand, because didn't you say it was anonymous when you'd spoken to Pfizer? Anonymous to Pfizer, but to the FDA. Was that also anonymized?
No.
No? Okay.
So no, I called actually first and spoke to a representative from the FDA. And she told me where to go on their website and what to do. And I followed her instruction. And so they had my email address. I gave them my phone number. I wanted to talk to them. I had a lot of things to talk to them about. But that happened eventually on the 29th of September of 2020. They emailed me back, and I spoke to an investigator or an inspector, Cannon, and Miss Cannon and I spoke for about an hour in length and in detail about every single concern. Mm-hmm. Well, not every single concern, but the ones that I highlighted in the email. And we spoke to them in detail. I told her that I was fired. She was very sympathetic to that. And I had full confidence in the Food and Drug Administration and the group that was going to, I thought, investigate. I was like, yes, I felt okay that they were going to swoop in and go to Ventavia, inspect the site, and these patients were, I don't even know what I expected to happen with the patients, but at least for the integrity of the data, so many things to happen. I just thought that they were going to go in and make it okay. And they still to this day have not inspected Ventavia's site. And I know that Ventavia continues to enroll in studies. In September of 2021, I was sent some information. It was given to me, and I looked at this information. And as of September of 21, they were enrolling or in follow-up in 40 different studies. And it's not just Pfizer's vaccine study that they're participating in, and every cohort, if you will, of adolescent patients, of children, of pregnant women. And I've seen all of that data, and it looks exactly the same as when I was there. They're not following up on adverse events. The principal investigator is not overseeing the clinical trial as he should, because he's busy in the hospital system working and doing endoscopies. So he's very infrequently on site. So they're just continuing to do these studies, these so
rolling
important
out the same
studies.
tricks. Yeah.
Same tricks, same crap data, same fraud in every single one of their studies. And the FDA is allowing this to continue. And I want to know when they're going to finally, somebody has got to stop Ventavia from doing what they're doing. These people are in danger.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost as if someone some people might think they even got rewarded for this kind of behavior as they got more studies out of Pfizer out of the back of this. It, one question that's sprung to mind a few times for myself, and I'm sure others have felt this as well. One, why has it taken so long for this to come out? And two, why is it that, to the best of my knowledge, to date, you're probably the only person that's spoken up? Surely other people have seen this, and you've mentioned other colleagues have spoken to you about it.
Mm-hmm. It's taken so long to come out. So after the 25th, after I filed the complaint with the FDA, I wanted to give them an opportunity to do what they should have done and go into Ventavia and inspect the site. And when I saw that that wasn't going to happen, my attorney, who was representing me for wrongful termination, because Ventavia fired me for
doing your job,
yeah, doing my job. Thank you. Yes. So I had that kind of just, it was pending. I was speaking to an attorney about wrongful termination. But then he says, I want you to talk to this other attorney. I think that this is so important, and what they've done is so egregious that you have more than just a wrongful termination lawsuit. This is a vaccine that the government is going to pay for. These are government funds that are going to be used. And if you truly want an investigation to ensue and be done correctly, you need to have the help of the United States government. And there is an action that you can pursue, a qui tam action, a lawsuit that I file on behalf of the United States government. So after meeting with this attorney and telling him my story, they were like, yes, this vaccine is misbranded. This vaccine is, the data that's been used in this vaccine is fraudulent. You have all the receipts, you have the proof. I had everything that I still have it, not on me. I've had to put it in different places because I'm afraid, but yeah, I had everything to prove exactly what I needed to show.
Everything to back up the claims that you've made.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you've got
and not
all the
just
evidence.
Me. It wasn't just me. It was also other employees at Ventavia that have come forward. There's 5 of us now.
Okay.
They will not come forward and speak publicly. I think that they're afraid. I think that they don't want to lose their jobs. And this has been tough. It's been difficult for me to be the one that's saying Pfizer's data isn't what they say it is. It's
you're having to bear the brunt of any repercussions, any blowback. Mm-hmm. You're having to be the face of it. I think that's important to note. People are afraid to lose their jobs, and you did lose your job as a result of it. And now you've mentioned that you've had to disperse the information and put it in other places because there's an element of fear. You're scared. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could, if you're okay, to talk to us about that.
Yeah, maybe in a second I'll talk to you about that. I want to talk to your audience about why it took so long for this information to come out. It wasn't because I didn't come forward. I came forward each minute that I saw something going on that was nefarious. I came forward. I had trust in a process. First, the scientific one. I then trusted the regulatory agencies to do their job. I thought that the FDA was going to, and not that I'm just so naive that I think that there's not corruption in government and regulatory bodies, but I just had faith that the FDA was going to go in and take care of this. And when they didn't, and I ended up deciding to file the case I did so knowing that once I filed it, it was going to immediately go under a seal and I would not be able to talk about it. I had to think about that, as I knew by this time it was, I don't know, November, and I knew emergency use authorization was coming. And so it was a tough decision to make, to allow that to happen. But I was told that this was the way to have it investigated, to have Ventavia investigated, not just Ventavia, but Icon and Pfizer, because they're responsible as well. So when that case was filed, everything, I couldn't talk about it anymore. And it went under seal initially for 60 days. And again, I just was so certain that in that 60 days that they were
the cavalry's coming.
Yes, that the Department of Justice was going to, direct the OIG and all these different departments involved were going to investigate, and we were gonna see the truth. And after that initial 60 days, they requested an extension of 6 months. And I didn't want to give it, but I was pressured to give it. I have email after email after email, every couple of weeks, every month, following up with these attorneys. I, warned them that I wasn't going to be quiet forever. And after the second 6-month extension that expired in September, the end of September of 2020, no investigation had pursued. So I said, screw it, man. This has just gone on long enough. And now, not that every age group matters, but the vaccine was coming after our children. And I couldn't be silent anymore. My former attorney, the ones who helped me file this lawsuit originally, warned me, said, Brooke, if you go public with your information, the government's going to come after you. Mm. And I said, well, let them come, because I'm not going to be quiet anymore. Let them come. I don't care what they do to me. And so 2 days later, he dropped me as his client and left me without representation in this case. And so I've since found another attorney, Robert Barnes, who's helping me move this case forward. But in that time, I knew that I couldn't take my story, my information, my evidence to the mainstream media. So I took it to the British Medical Journal, and I knew the British Medical Journal was reputable. They would do their diligence in reviewing the evidence that I brought forward. And that's exactly what they did. They vetted me. There were weeks and weeks and weeks of them doing what they do best and then reporting on it. And so that story, that publication, was out on November 2nd of 2021.
Yeah. And I remember reading it and just being absolutely gobsmacked and thinking to myself, much like you thought to yourself when you were attempting to get the FDA involved, that any minute now, the cavalry is going to come riding in and say, listen, we have to put a stop on things and look over this data and see if the concerns are valid and see what we need to do as a result of these things that have been brought up and brought to our attention, because it essentially reframes the whole clinical trial into a different light, and it's not a very good light. It's not a very flattering light for the clinical trial.
It's fraud.
Yeah. Yeah. No two ways about it.
There's not. No.
No. So I think that brings us to the next question. You had your lawyer who helped bring this case forward, then decide almost at the drop of a hat to drop you as a client, and then you're now with Robert Barnes. And you've also mentioned the fact that you are afraid, there is some fear there. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about that? As I think people may initially think that that's just hyperbole, but for your lawyer to say, actually, I'm gonna take two steps this way, and good luck on your journey, and for you to have to put your evidence that you've gathered in separate spots in order to ensure that it's safe, it's a bit of a scary thought. It's something out of a movie almost.
In October, on October 9th of 2020, after the FDA complaint was filed, after the inspector calls me back, Pfizer actually called me back too. I'd made a couple of attempts from an unknown number to call them a few days prior to my excuse me, prior to my termination, to let them know what I was finding. And I never called Pfizer from my own personal cell phone. I never called them from the office. I always did so like at night at home. And the calls I made were never answered, and I never left a message. And eventually, just kind of gave up on contacting them and getting a hold of them, because I'd already decided to go to the FDA. So on the 26th, so the day after I'm fired from Ventavia, the person I was trying to reach at Pfizer does call me back, and he calls me back on this number that belonged to my husband's work at the time. So it didn't list your name when you call. So I wasn't. I was pretty sure that they wouldn't be able to find out who I was based on that anonymous number, or they shouldn't have been able to. And when I talked to Arturo, who was the site liaison, he was a direct Pfizer employee. I did so anonymously. I didn't tell him my name. I didn't tell him what site I worked for. My conversation with him was brief. It was like 15 minutes. And that conversation pretty much mirrored what was in my FDA complaint. I went over briefly my main concerns, which were the patient safety, the falsification of data, the fabrication of data, and the unblinding, which had the potential to do so much. And did I mention serious adverse events not being followed up on? So it was a quick call, is my point. And he asked me my name, and I just told him I'm not going to give that information. I'm just not. Take my anonymous complaint and
do what you got to do with it.
Do what you're going to do. And so that was that. I never heard from Arturo again, except on October 9th of 2020, on my personal cell phone, I started getting a call from an anonymous, or like a number that I didn't have saved. I didn't recognize it. And so the first time that my phone rang and I see this number, I just clicked the red button and sent it to voicemail, because I didn't know who it was. But they called right back. And I did the same thing. I just pressed the red button and hung up and didn't think anything of it until they called again. And I'm like, what in the hell? Like, who's calling me? But we were in the garage, and I was with my husband. We were playing darts, and he was like, just don't answer it. So I didn't. Those 3 calls just back to back, repeated. And then I get a text message from that same number. I should have had this up already, because I could read it to you directly.
Fantastic. Yeah.
So on October 9th, I get a text message, and it says, "Miss Jackson, I'm calling you on behalf of Pfizer. We would like to talk to you about the concerns you have relayed about a clinical trial site. Would you please be willing to talk and give us some additional information? Thanks. Mark Barnes. And in parentheses, he has attorney for Pfizer. And when I saw that, my first thought was, how did this man get my phone number? And so that's exactly my message back to him. How did you get my number, Mr. Barnes? And he says, from a Pfizer colleague to whom you spoke, Arturo. He and others asked me to follow up. And my reply was, interesting, being that I never shared my name with Dr. Alfaro, or Arturo, who's Dr. Alfaro. And he says, apologies, I am just assuming your name, but I don't know it for sure. And I said, now my interest is really piqued. You mentioned others, Mr. Barnes. Who are you referring to? And he said, other compliance colleagues at Pfizer who are very concerned about the issues you raised with Arturo. And he goes on to, would you please be willing to speak? Just so you know, the door is open. If you want to relay any additional information, the more we can know from concerned people, then the more quickly we can understand things and correct them as needed. So one might look at this text message thread and think, well, it's just Pfizer.
Innocent,
doing their
right?
diligence. Yeah, they're just doing their their job and their diligence and making sure that they're following up on a complaint. But for him to use my cell phone number as a way of contacting me, to know my name, for me to ask him, how did you get my, how do you know my name? For him to just assume it is so, it's scary. It scares
unnerving.
me.
Yeah.
It is very unnerving. And the mention of others. Well, I don't know. Maybe my mind shouldn't have gone there, but it certainly did. And there hasn't been a day that I have not looked over my shoulder and thought, what else is Pfizer capable of?
No, I completely wholeheartedly understand that. And I mean, the other thing is, what's a lawyer doing asking what your concerns are? Surely that should be someone on the same level as Arturo, who's in charge in the clinical sites or something like that, because that's who it's relevant for. The fact that
how about you send me something? How about you send me a professional letter,
email,
and request a meeting? But again, I mean, it brings up the question: who gave Mark Barnes my phone number? Yeah. How did he get my cell phone number? Did he get it from Ventavia? Did he get it from the FDA? I really have got to find that out. I now know who Mark Barnes is, and from another podcast that I did with someone who used to work for the FBI, and I know that he's not a very nice person. He's been described as the cleanup guy.
Not the kind of person you want phoning and texting you. No.
But I still have so much, I guess, faith in the truth prevailing, and that's kind of just where I have to put it. I hope my story inspires more people to come forward if they have information about any of the vaccines, not just Pfizer. I don't have, a vendetta. Yeah. I don't. I think they're. I look at the whole health, even my career. I mean, I've considered making changes because I just have lost so much faith, but I I trusted this process. I was able to have my children through science. I did in vitro fertilization. So without science and clinical trials, I wouldn't have my children. So data integrity is so important to me, and clinical trials are important to me, but they have to be done properly. And I'm not saying that things and mistakes don't happen. There are bad people out there, but there are good people out there too, and ones that care about research. And I'm one of those. And I just want a couple things: accountability. And I don't know what this looks like yet, but more regulatory oversight in clinical trials. That has got to happen. It's got to happen.
I think for me, it's comforting that there are people like yourself that are there, that are involved in the clinical trials in some way or another, and in good conscience come forward with the information that they have. And that's no slight to anybody that hasn't. Everyone has their reasons for what they do, and like you said, there are people with genuine fears, much like yourself.
Sure, absolutely.
There are reasons people don't step up to say something one way or the other. So, I'm glad that you've decided not to step out. And like you say, you're a firm believer in science and the scientific method. I think that's also important to emphasize here, as you're involved in the scientific method. And if you weren't a believer in it, you wouldn't be there. You wouldn't be there doing what you're doing, and be that for your job, or be that in the course of action that you've decided to take as a result of fraudulent data, as a result of a fraudulent clinical trial study. So it's also encouraging that you've mentioned that there are other colleagues that are stepping up, or former colleagues that are stepping up to share their information as well. And because of people like yourself who have decided to take a massive leap of faith in coming forward, hopefully the truth will find its way out.
The thing there is the truth is already there, right? It's not just my words. No. And this is something that I kind of, point out to people who, talk bad about, the British Medical Journal, and there's, anti-vaxxers and all of this nonsense. It wasn't me that the BMJ is defending, or it's not my information and my stuff. It's evidence that, cannot be denied. These are internal documents. These are things that I handed over. So they're reporting on a story, period, not on a person. My beliefs are mine. And to be frank, are the business of no one's except me. And that's kind of been frustrating to watch. But, I'm able to talk about things that I wasn't able to talk about so many months ago. There was suppression of the BMJ story, censorship, fact check, whatever you want to call it. But now I can speak to whoever I want, especially now that the seal has been lifted. The United States government is declining to do anything about what I've alleged. And so I'm, with the help of Mr. Barnes, Robert Barnes, not the Mark Barnes.
No relation.
No relation. No. Are moving forward with this lawsuit. I guess I'm not as confident as I don't know what I think. I guess I have good days and I have bad days. Some days I'm so sure that this information is finally going to be dealt with appropriately. And then other days I'm like, man, I don't even want to live in this country anymore, but where would I go?
Yeah, it's true. It's all coming out. But I think to your point of confident, not confident, it gave me or maybe it gives you some comfort. The Pfizer stakeholder brief that went out recently. I don't know if you've come across that at all.
Yes, I have.
Yeah, where they say that there might be some unfavorable data coming forward, which may affect the share prices and whatnot. So
Mhm.
I think in a way, whoever reads that, there's one way to interpret that, which is unfavorable data means that exactly that, unfavorable data. So I think it's coming more to the fore, and you know,
I do too.
fingers crossed that things go in the right direction with this.
Yeah, yeah. There are many people, many groups of physicians and not that are coming forward. And I know with the FDA lawsuit and the documents that are coming out, as part of that suit, are going to be helpful. I've had an opportunity to look at some of those document releases from the FDA from the 18th of January and I believe it was the 28th of January, that were released from the FDA. There were some of those documents related directly to the Ventavia sites. So I'm looking at those, I'm studying those, I'm building spreadsheets on those. And I can say with 100% confidence that the case report forms, the data that was released from the FDA, does not match what is at the clinical trial site.
So things are
It doesn't.
worse than reported than what's being released.
What is being released does not match the documentation that I have seen related to the same patients. And that's what I know we're kind of running close. We're running close on time, or maybe we're not. I can keep going, but you tell me.
We got time. Yeah.
So during a clinical trial, when a patient comes in, I wish I had an example. When a patient comes in and they enroll into the study, informed consent, happens, and at that point we start collecting demographics, height, weight, blood pressure, temperature,
Baseline data, right?
Baseline data. What medications are you taking? What comorbidities do you have? Have you ever had any surgery? When were those surgery dates? So all of this information for Ventavia specifically, but it's different because the clinical trial data collection process is not standardized. So one site may collect it electronically, or one site may collect all of those data points on paper. Ventavia collects those on paper. So everything that happens during the clinical trial visit is written down. And then that written information is then transcribed electronically to an online platform or system for Pfizer. So what happens after that data is entered into Pfizer's electronic data capture system, it's called EDC. Someone from either Pfizer or, in this situation, ICON, should have come to the clinical trial site and looked at the paper and had up the electronic data capture system at the same time and looked at that blood pressure. And let's just say the blood pressure was 120/80, written down on Ventavia's source paperwork, okay? Then they would look at Pfizer's electronic data capture system and look at the blood pressure that was manually entered there. Let's say, for example, instead of what was written 120/80, whoever entered it entered 120/08 instead. So 120/80 is original. The coordinator, whoever enters it's 120/08. That data that's wrong in Pfizer's electronic data capture system is queried. So then the coordinator would go back. She would, look, or he would look at the source and say, oh, I made a transcription error, correct it in the electronic data capture system and move on. So that's how Pfizer gets all of their data. They get it from what is entered into the system and what they query. So Pfizer has the capability to query any data point that's been captured at the study site level and make it anything they want. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It gives them the opportunity to decide that post-injection measurements are also going to be made. It gives them the ability to then query that information to set the data a particular way, perhaps. Is this the inference that we're going for here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so that's what, when I was mentioning earlier, the data that has been released from Pfizer's data set, from their electronic case report forms, I have copies of original site source that show different information. And I don't want to get into like exactly what that is because, my attorney has that, and, we're working on, looking through all the data, and it's a long process.
There's also an element of potentially biasing whoever sits in the jury and things like that. Someone could then use that to say, I won't ask you to dive into specifics on that, but just the thought alone that that's a possibility is fascinating to say the least.
Yeah, and it's really, I've talked to so many people and physicians, and even those that are familiar with clinical trials in general, don't understand. A lot of them don't understand how the information is captured from the site level and how Pfizer actually gets that information. But that is how, for the Ventavia site specifically, everything's written on paper, then it's transcribed electronically into Pfizer's database. There should be a check to make sure that data matches. I guess that didn't happen because the data doesn't match. Not in everything that I've looked at, but there are
significant proportion, would you say?
Yes, and maybe not even a significant proportion, because there hasn't been a lot of data released yet. But in just the very first patient that I happened to look at and have actual information on, it was a serious adverse event. It was a serious adverse event that happens after the patient was enrolled into the placebo group initially, got both of the injections, and was unblinded at the time that Pfizer told them they should be, and got the injection, and a few weeks later actually was hospitalized with hepatic injury. So that was the very first thing that I looked at and that I saw. And as I'm going through these Pfizer electronic case report forms and looking at what data I do have, doesn't match. It doesn't match. And there was also in that same case report form, they have data managers, and these data managers are looking through, all these case report forms and looking at terminology, for example, diagnosis. And there was even in a query that was issued to the site for Ventavia to change the diagnosis that the patient was given. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the patient was discharged with a diagnosis. That diagnosis was captured in Pfizer's electronic data capture system. And the data manager, in reviewing that information, asked the site to change the diagnosis.
That's that.
It blows your mind, right?
Flat out fraud.
Yeah.
Flat out fraud.
I have seen I'm not defending I'm not defending Pfizer or their data managers or Ventavia in any way, but I've seen that before, for there to be a clarification maybe, or a change. But when you have a diagnosis as you're released from the hospital, it's just you just don't do that. I'm not saying that. I don't even know what I'm saying. It is, there's something new every day that blows my mind. It really does. Shocks me. And I just need someone to look at this data. I have, so much information that is on the public domain, other information that's not, and it's hard to work and take care of kids and look at all this data but to be honest, it's not my job. It's just the job of the FDA.
Regulators. It's literally their job. It's in the title. Point. Yeah. It is literally their job to regulate the industry, to check the trial data, to check that things are as they seem and there isn't anything untoward going on. And the fact
but Pfizer's done that. Pfizer said they've said publicly that they've investigated the allegations, and there was nothing that would affect the integrity of the data, which is a lie. It's a blatant lie. It does affect the data.
People listening to this might be familiar with the show Dexter. Sending Dexter to investigate one of his own murder scenes. Of course, he's going to say that.
Oh, I remember that show.
You're essentially sending the guys who are responsible for it in the first place to investigate the trial site. And I don't know if conflict of interest springs to mind, but that's a word that springs to mind for me, for sure.
Yeah, that's why I said, from this, I want, those responsible to be held accountable. And there has got to be some change in the regulatory process, the approval process, who's allowed to approve these, who's allowed to sit on boards, who's part of these, not just with the vaccine, but speaking about the vaccine, these, vaccine experts who, have asked to give an opinion on whether or not this vaccine is safe for anyone, but not to know, but maybe they do know, maybe they don't know, but there are serious questions about this clinical trial. And I watched how just quickly these trials were started, how quickly they were run, how, Pfizer was in a race to be number one to get their vaccine to market. So I can imagine that if this type of thing happened at Ventavia, is there a possibility that it happened at more clinical trial sites? And I just, in my heart, I really think that probably more than likely this happened at other clinical trial sites. And for Pfizer to only inspect 9 out of the 153 clinical trial sites that were participating in this study, I'm shocked again.
Less than 10%. Okay. There's a lot of people walking through a lot of doors and they're only deciding to cherry pick what they're going to look at. There's a lot of things that baffle the mind, and to say the least, that it leaves a lot to be desired in the approach that has been taken at every level throughout the issues that you've had with Ventavia, Icon, and Pfizer, with regards to the FDA's approach to this, and unfortunately now the DOJ as well. Right? And like you say,
they've failed. They failed us. Absolutely.
And like you say, it's not your word against theirs. It's not Brook thinks X, Y, Z. Brook has evidence of X and Y and Z and exhibit A, B, C all the way to Z and back again.
1 through 29, actually.
There we go.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. And that was just, there are 29 exhibits in my lawsuit against them.
Yeah.
But that was back from January of 2021. Like I said, I've accumulated more since
data.
then.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's, is something, again, my attorney is working on. So I have to give him a chance to get the rest out there. But I'm just, excuse me, I'm just thankful for the opportunity to speak with you and to your audience. And I
really appreciate your time.
Sure. Pardon me. I do get on Twitter and I try to answer as many questions as that come to me for people wanting to understand. I don't ever offer my opinion about whether or not someone should get the vaccine. That is a personal decision, and one that I think that anyone considering should talk to their own physician about. And whether you trust him or her, I mean, that's just we open up this
Pandora's box.
Exactly. And I'm just not going there. But if there are any questions about the clinical trials and what Ventavia, what Pfizer, and what Icon have done, I'm happy to
talk about it. Where can people find you on Twitter?
And my handle is I am Brook Jackson.
Handy. Fantastic. Brooke, I really, really appreciate you giving us your time. And I wish you the best with the trial and everything going forward. And thank you very much for what you've done and what you continue to do. And I hope that it inspires others to potentially make the same steps. Is there anything that you think at this point in time, what do you think people need to be aware of at this point in time, whether it's related to the vaccine or whether it's something else? Is there something that people need to start looking at or looking into?
That's tough. That's a tough question. I mean, since this has all kind of transpired, it's made me open my eyes to a lot of things that I didn't realize have been happening for a long time. Hindsight's always 2020, right? Looking back, and this is just me, I'm healthy. I'm 40 years old. I do not have any underlying medical conditions, and I regret getting the vaccine. But again, hindsight's 2020, and I was misled by so many mainstream media, FDA, CDC, those that I trusted. And yeah, I would have done a lot of things differently. But I think that the number one thing is that I wouldn't have got a vaccine.
Given the right information, I think is important there.
I did so because of what I was told was, going to keep me from getting COVID and was going to keep me from spreading that to other people. And, I got it in January, and I was still looking for a job, but I made the assumption that I was going to be patient facing and maybe, back in a hospital setting or working in transplant. I worked in transplant for many years, and that was very rewarding for me. So I thought that's kind of where I was going to go back, what I was going to go back to. And so I needed my vaccine.
Yeah.
And that turns out to be not the case. And yeah, that's, I guess I'm going to have to really think about that and practice that answer, because I don't want people to hear my story and think that I'm for or against or one-sided or the other. I really don't give a damn what people do. I just think that there needs to be full transparency. You need to have an ability to make a decision on your health that's,
I
truthful.
think hearing everything that you've said, and I think for myself, listening to what you said just there as well, your biggest thing isn't for or against. You've already said people should people should speak to their physician. I think your biggest thing is informed consent.
Yes.
From everything that I've heard about is informed consent. It's getting all the information one way or the other and making the decision of what's best for you and potentially for those around you. And
exactly.
I agree with that. And I think for myself as well, if there was a message that I'd want people to take away, it is inform yourself, speak to your doctor, get informed and make the decision that's right for you, and try not to be coerced one way or the other. Don't let me coerce you into not doing it or doing it. Don't let you do that. Don't let anyone else. Get informed. And we can only do that if the data is reliable.
Yes.
But thank you very much.
So there's
I really
your
appreciate
advice.
your time. Yeah.
Data's not reliable. There's your answer.